Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Rebecca Ray with the Conference Board, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the next installment of our Global Leadership Forecast webcast series of webcasts. It's an absolute delight today to be here with my colleague Evan Sinar. Dr. Sinar is both the Chief Scientist and a Vice President at DDI, and he was the lead author on this Global Leadership Forecast series, so you could not be in better hands. And he and I are going to try to share some of the highlights today. So, Evan, thank you for joining me on Rethinking Leadership Potential, making the most out of high potential talent.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Terrific.
Great to be here.
Well, you know, we've tried to take a very large report and distill it into key sections. And so today we'll be spending some time focusing a lot on high potentials. We hope to share with you the insights that will allow you to have some particular insights from today, largely around the practices that matter most. We've taken a look to see what it is that actually has an impact on developing high potentials. We want to talk about the power of diversity and inclusion when identifying high potential talent. And we also want to talk a little bit about the things that you can do versus those that are an array of things you could choose from that may not be as effective. And what are the kinds of ways in which we want to help these leaders develop themselves. Before we do that, I want to just remind you that attending this webcast provides you an opportunity to get continuing education credits from a variety of providers, and you see the screen in front of you. There's one in which you'll actually need to stay awake during the entire webcast and push an OK button 3 times during the webcast in order for you to qualify. But please do follow the instructions there as you see the folks with whom we partner for continuing education credits. So as I mentioned, this is one of an entire series. We've been mapping this out for some time now. And when we're all done, there's close to 12, 14 of these webcasts, and I would encourage you to take a look at the entire lineup. We have so many of the, well, frankly, it was a village, the number of authors on this report, led by Evan, and it was a real privilege. We partnered with EY on this report this year, but DDI and the Conference Board has partnered in the past on this Global Leadership Forecast report, which is arguably one of the longest running and largest and most comprehensive leadership development studies out there. So we have a variety of things to share over the course of these webcasts. Today we're going to focus on high potentials, but just for a moment, a little bit about the research itself. So it is large. More than 25,000 business leaders participated, almost 2,500 organizations, and there were more than 2,500 leaders in HR. And if you take a look at the graphic here, you can see that the leader level parallels what you might expect in terms of generational representation as you go forth, with some who are just beginning their leadership journey as a first-time supervisor, all the way to those who are at the C-suite. There's a good representation of the types of industry across the world. There's a split, it's almost even, of those who identify themselves as high potentials, not just simply because their mother thinks they're a high potential, but because they believe that they are part of a high potential program at their various organizations. There is more of a skew toward male respondents than women. And when you think about the challenge that so many of us face in leadership development of making sure that there's adequate female representation in the leadership pipeline, we know that there are a couple of critical junctures where women are less represented in the pipeline. And so this is, while an accurate reflection of sort of where we are in terms of leadership development, I think it's a reminder to all of us that we need to take a look at the ways in which we can ensure that women continue in the pipeline. Certainly if you look at country representation, it's a good generation as well, is also very well represented in the report. So one of the first questions we asked in this report, and it parallels much of what we ask in other reports here at the Conference Board, was simply, if you're a CEO, a C-suite leader, what is it that you're concerned about in terms of making sure that you have a viable organization to hand to the next generation of leaders? And they had a laundry list of 20 some odd things they could pick from, including cybersecurity and terrorism and failing infrastructure and currency fluctuation. And what was interesting to us to see is that, again, this time, You see at the top, developing leaders and retaining talent. That is uppermost in the minds of C-suite leaders and CEOs in particular. And so it's really, really important for us to make sure that a brilliant strategy can be executed, not only by the resident members of an organization who have the skills and the knowledge requisite to deliver on that, but also the leaders who are going to take these folks through this time of disruption and change. And so these are vitally important, and we want to talk a little bit about how that happens. So, Evan, do you want to share with us a little bit about sort of the state of investment in leadership development and where we are?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca. And as we looked at identifying potential as a core theme across this research, again, reflecting on this being seen as one of the top challenges for some of these top leaders in these organizations, one of the troubling trends we've seen is the decline in future bench strength readiness. So that's the leaders that are prepared to step into key roles for the next 3 years out. So whereas we've seen leader quality generally plateau, we've seen a steady decrease in this next generation group of leaders, and this perhaps is what's causing much of the concern from the C-suite. So this is something that we've been able to track over time. As Rebecca mentioned, this is research that we've done going back almost 20 years. And as we look back across the past 8 or 9 years or so, we've seen a decline in this future bench strength. So it really speaks to the continued challenges achieving the return on investment resulted from leadership development, leadership assessment programs. So despite billions and billions of dollars going into these activities, many organizations still continue to not only fail to see a return, but in many cases, actually seeing a continued decline in future readiness, so down to the point where it's only about 1 in 7 organizations feel they have a strong bench in place over this next 3 years. So looking at some of the broader trends across this research, so looking at the ways in which organizations are approaching the topic of high potential, one way that we described this theme is that the potential pool, often a very narrowly contained group of individuals, that's growing. It's growing for organizations who do it well in terms of diversity and the representation of those as organizations look to identify more individuals as high potentials deeper into the organization. So we are finding that many organizations are struggling to see the returns on investment for the high potential programs themselves. So we're at the point where around 2/3 of organizations have these programs in place. So 65%, we've seen that hovering fairly steady over the past several years. However, of those that have those programs in place, more than 2/3 say that they're not very effective. So they're not fully meeting their goals. And as part of the research, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper in this, as Rebecca mentioned, to be more evidence-based and data-driven in which practices were actually driving higher levels of success for these programs.
Evan, that's pretty sobering. That's a self-assessment, right? That 68% of those who have a program don't feel that it's very effective. I'm hopeful that they're going to watch the broadcast series, and I'm hopeful that they'll pick up the report. But it is a sobering assessment, I think, and explains why there aren't more indications of return on investment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think when we look at the challenges that the HR function feels meeting the needs of those senior level leaders that are expressing concern, we can see why that's the case. Because even at the HR level, they're seeing gaps in these programs. And that's despite very heavy investment going into these programs. So starting off looking at the hours that leaders spend in structured leadership development programs. So ramping up from about 27 hours per year for first level leaders up to 38 hours per year for these high potential leaders. These are programs specifically focused on structured development activities. So nearly a person week there, about a year in terms of hours. So of course, this is pulling them off of other activities, other high profile projects and activities that are generating value for the business. So there's already an investment going into these programs at an hour level. And that's paralleled also on the dollar side of these investments. So high potential leaders for the organizations who do this well, that does extend across the different levels of the pipeline, but we are seeing a higher on average investment for those high potential leaders. So on average, almost $4,000 per leader per year. And of course, we can see how that investment scales rapidly across organizations that might have tens of thousands, or in some cases over 100,000 leaders identified as high potential. So there's very heavy investment going into these programs, even on average higher than the average senior level leader. So there's some outsized investment for these populations, which puts a premium on understanding what makes these programs work best to drive impact and more successful outcomes of these programs. So another view that we've looked at in the research is the risk associated with unfilled or unfillable positions. So this is also something that we've tracked over time. So we ask organizations to determine, of your most critical positions, how many of these could be filled immediately by internal candidates? An alternative to that, of course, is you're either hiring externally and bearing cost, bearing time, and also bearing, on average, a lower success rate for individuals that are brought in externally to the organization. Generally, our research and other research finds that individuals who are brought up from the inside are more likely to be successful in their roles. Or the other alternative to address this issue is that you are putting individuals into roles, internal or otherwise, that aren't ready for them. So you bear a higher risk of failure there as well. So this is another troubling statistic that speaks to the future side of leadership and the general perception, in actuality, of many organizations being unprepared for this next generation of leaders.
You know, Evan, we have a great question here. I'm hopeful I can share this with you and perhaps get your thoughts. So we have a question from Stephanie. She wants to know about how much the expectations of senior leadership plays into that relatively sobering assessment of effectiveness for high potential programs. And Stephanie goes on to say that I see some C-suite leaders who think people need to walk on water to be ready to step into new leadership roles. I know that all of us, when we look back, we think, of course, we were ready for that great new promotion, but it's sometimes not as easy to see that in someone else and think they're just as ready. I think we forget we had some gaps to fill too. But what do you think about that in terms of senior leader perceptions?
Well, and I think that's something that we look at in our research when we try to gauge how leader quality changes over time. And it's very hard to be sure that when you're comparing across time, that you're not also trying to account for differences in the expectations for leaders. And I do think those are increasing. So as organizations in some cases get a little bit leaner, or as they have aggressive growth plans in place, that does raise the expectations for leaders. So a leader who might have been good enough 3 years ago may no longer be good enough. And I think there is dual forms of pressure here coming from the C-suite, where they're recognizing that they're being pressured, whether by shareholders or by the broader needs of the business, to put in place aggressive growth plans, but recognizing that when they fall short of these growth plans, leader capability is also at the heart of that gap. And you've also got perceptions coming from HR themselves, who see the challenges with continually cycling people through these programs, or potentially an even worse outcome, identifying someone for these programs, then having them leave the organization for a better opportunity and not able to keep them sustained and engaged in their roles. So I think this pressure is coming from both senior leadership, but also from HR professionals who are struggling to feed the needs of the business through high quality.
You know, Evan, I think that's right. I mean, in other parts of this report, we've talked about the need for leaders to be able to either lead digitization at their organizations, or at least to be an effective leader through this time of digital disruption. And that's a real challenge. And so I do think that you have a lot of people who, unless they are very clear on the leaders that they need, are going to be continually faced with a situation where the leaders that are produced are not quite what's needed because they don't have a clear and strong commitment to building the kinds of leaders that they need. And quite often that requires a great deal of training, much more so than the rates that you showed us earlier might suggest. So.
And I think your point about the ongoing evolution of skills is also important. So for organizations that have only defined their pillars for success or their key competencies, if they've defined those even as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, some of those are now out of date through the influence of digital technology on core skills like delegation or collaboration, the ways in which leaders are using technology to exhibit those skills. It requires a more frequent refreshing of the definitions of success for leadership. And if that's not occurring, organizations can have an unrealistically rosy perception of readiness when in fact they may be calibrating towards an outdated set of skills within the workforce and for leaders in particular.
No, thanks, Evan. We have another question here that wants to know whether or not there'll be a 2019 Global Leadership Forecast coming out in January. Do you want to share a little bit about the long history of DDI with this report series?
Sure. So we produce this report generally about every 3 years. So we'd likely be conducting the research in 2019 and over into 2020, and then publishing something towards the end of that year. So we do that to be able to look at some changes over time and some of the key trends there. We do some interim research projects. Certainly the conference board does some interim research projects. And Rebecca gave an example earlier of a great opportunity to connect the data points between a few of these different studies. So we do look for opportunities to tap into some key topics and revisit them more frequently than every 3 years. But for the broader research study, that's on approximately a 3-year cadence. That allows us to see some true progression in some of the core leadership trends, particularly for something like digital transformation, which wasn't even on many businesses' radars in 2014 when we last did this research, 2014, 2015. So that's why we have that kind of cadence. So we will be doing some interim research at DDI. I know the conference board does as well, and that allows us to put a more focused and more repeated cadence on some of the topics that might be changing within that 3-year period, and then we'll take a broader look with this scale and scope of global study in 2020 most likely.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect example, the slide we're on here, that is able to compare the number of critical positions that are fillable at the moment with internal candidates, and that's a comparison from the earlier one 3 years ago. So that is the rhythm and the cadence. So thank you, Stephen, for the question. Okay, Evan, back to you.
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. So one terminology point that we do think is important to make here is with how organizations are defining potential, but also defining diversity within their organization. So hidden potential, we feel, really does take many forms, and it requires a broader view of high potential talent, a broader view of perspectives that individuals bring to the organization. So this does include identity forms of diversity based on gender, based on age and generations. We've got 3 generations well represented in the workforce right now between millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers. Also, of course, racial and cultural forms of diversity, which are particularly salient for organizations that have global operations. There's also a cognitive form of diversity that also plays in here with diversity of thought and perspectives. That's often what leads to higher quality decision making, bringing in those perspectives from those from diverse experiences and backgrounds. Personality diversity, and that's a case where some organizations, I think, can fall prey to this perception that all new employees or new leaders need to fit some profile that matches current leaders. And that can be a dangerous trap that organizations can fall into when they're essentially looking to clone the current group of leaders, how they look, how they act, how they think, how they talk. That can actually limit forms of diversity that are critical to maintaining a highly balanced view of potential, as well as functional forms of diversity. So in some of our research, we've found that there's a few well-traveled paths to the C-suite, often leading through sales organization or the operations organization, whereas other functions may in fact have equally strong skill profiles, but are less often sought after and really given opportunities to make their way into the C-suite. So we do advocate for a broader view of diversity and of potential, thinking about how organizations are solving this challenge, not in a myopic way, but in a broader way that takes into account various forms of diversity and various types of perspectives that contribute value to the business.
Well, thanks, Evan. You know, I think we'll shift gears a little bit and start talking about, well, what do you do with these high potentials once you've found them? So what you see here on this slide are 10 top practices for leadership development programs in general, and there are a couple that are specifically tied to working with high potential individuals. So a couple of things. The way to look at this chart, and you see the top 10 practices, and they're written on the side at an angle at the top, and just below that is the high potential leader success rate when these things are effectively in place. And you see what happens to the overall leader success rate when they are absent. And you see the gap here between those two. So this is the reason why it's important to get these things right. They're sort of the building blocks of decent leadership development programs and approaches. I just want to call out a couple that are specifically important as we think about high potentials. Now, the data here is the result of asking senior HR leaders to talk about the programs that they are responsible for. And there are 4 in particular: the unbiased identification of high potentials and the consistent identification of high potentials. Amazing to us in the conversations that we have in other settings as well as part of this research is how many people actually talk about the fact that they don't think that the processes at their organization are free of bias or free of preconceived notions, or that they aren't administered consistently. So there are 2 of the 10 overall practices that are particularly important to get right. For those of us who've been in the leadership development space, as I was as a chief talent officer for many years, when you have those conversations around the talent review process, if you can't get people to be consistent in terms of what we're looking for and the selection process, it's a real challenge if you can't get people to identify what does a future leader need to look like here at X organization, and where are the people, casting as wide a net as possible, where are the people that we're going to find earlier in career to bring them through these talent pools. 2 others that are particularly important in the elements for high potential is objective assessments of high potential, and to be able to see them with a recognized set of standard behaviors, accomplishments that would allow them to be selected for and to remain in a high potential program. Because remember, being selected as a high potential is a snapshot in time. It's not a tattoo. And so if you have people who are selected for high potential programs, it's incumbent upon them to deliver at a higher level, to be to remain in a program where they're going to get higher levels of attention, higher levels of senior leadership time, more dollars per head is going to be spent on them, and they need to be clearly moving away from the pack to show that they are indeed the future of the organization. And the last one I'll mention is a personalized high potential development program. You can't build one of those unless you've done an accurate assessment and you know where someone's gaps are. Everyone has them, everyone has developmental needs, but it's important to be able to identify what those are and to build a development plan that specifically addresses them. Now, if you look at the larger picture now, these are the remaining elements in a leadership development program. You must have a fair and objective talent review. There has to be performance management processes that are fair, that are consistent, and that are not just some trendy approach to performance management or some throwback from the 50s. I think it's important to articulate performance, to identify and articulate differences in contribution and talent, but you need to have a system that is transparent. Nothing will kill leadership development or even organizational culture faster than to feel as though some are treated differently and that there are some people who have perhaps a different path that they're on, and it's not apparent to others how that's done. You can't look at talent and the contribution without looking at competency-centric work and making sure that we understand the ways in which people are progressing and contributing, to be able to identify leaders' strengths, to actually have a talent management process that is both strategic, i.e. Tied to the business needs, and also consistent. And it's amazing to us in the work that's being done, either our colleagues at EY or DDI, or even some of the questions that come up here when we work with our member companies at the conference board, is how many people don't feel comfortable that they can accurately depict the level of strength in the leadership cohort as well as among rank and file employees in terms of their ability to execute against the strategy. And that, my friends, is not good. So if we take a look at the next one, next slide, What we're really looking here is, okay, so we get this, now what do we do with this? So Evan, do you want to speak to this for a moment?
Absolutely, and I think you oriented this topic well. So we want this research not just to be interesting, but to be useful and to be prescriptive, and take advantage of the data set we have here to provide some evidence-based recommendations for where to go from here. So now what, as a talent professional or as an HR professional. So starting with broadening the potential pool. So we've seen through our research, and others have found this as well, that as organizations broaden their pool, both from a diversity perspective, but also deepening within the organization, we see advantages of that on the bottom line. So we see advantages such that organizations who extend their view of potential all the way down to frontline levels of leadership, those organizations are much more likely to be financially successful, not just as a result of those factors, because they're doing many things well to build those pipelines, but that is one key factor that links to organization success. Gender diversity, not just numbers. So even though organizations generally are expanding their number of high potential pools, they're not doing that without accounting for some of the key practices that Rebecca mentioned around objectivity, avoidance of bias. So they're making smarter decisions about how to expand those pools. They build in more data-driven objectivity, so they're using tools that build in objectivity, build in a structured evaluation of key strengths, skills, personality characteristics, using those more scalably across the pipeline, and also being more transparent. I think many organizations have moved past the question of do we or don't we tell them. They find that in many cases, particularly in an environment where connectivity is at an all-time high, it's very hard to have secret lists of pools. It's also a negator of transparency to these programs. So more organizations are bringing out visibility elements of these programs, and generally we find that those transparency and visibility practices lead to higher levels of success. If we look at a next level of practices that really are how organizations are truly differentiating on the dimension of high potential. So as we've looked across the continuum of organizations, about 2,500 of them, the organizations who are truly differentiating themselves from their peers, standing out from the rest, what are they actually doing differently? One of the surprising findings for us was just how important it was to spend time in these programs, and that goes along with personalization, it goes along with more immersive development programs, and in fact, we found that the hours spent in structured development programs had a stronger link to business outcomes than the sheer money spent. So we've seen the challenges with a pure financially based view of investment and payoff. So it's not just the money spent, but it's also the hours, the immersion, the tailoring that's provided to those that are in high potential pools that's paying off. As high potential leaders seek forms of learning that aren't just cohort based, that don't just treat them as one of a large group of individuals within this high potential pool, and actually personalize the development activities to their need and to their own development plans. This too has been shown to boost success. Analytics, we found this throughout the research as a key backbone for many of the practices, not just for high potentials, but more broadly across the scope of talent management. And unfortunately, many organizations aren't following through on their investment in high potential programs with the measurement, the metrics, the analytics that go along with tracking the outcomes of those programs. And in fact, many don't even track the return on the potential investment currently. So that's a case of where common sense doesn't translate to common practice for many organizations, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's, I think, we'll stay on this slide for just a moment. I think one of the things that's very disturbing is the absence of the ability to articulate the impact through the use of analytics. We see that across much of the spectrum in human capital, not just in this particular area for high potentials. But when you think about where the money is spent and where we hope the impact will be, I can't imagine that there are too many more years where we're not going to be held accountable. And that's part of what we've talked about today, is where's the accountability, and particularly among managers for developing high potentials. Now, Evan, you touched on this a bit. We have a question here from Deborah, and she talked about the personalized hypo development strategy Would this make the case for moving hypo programs closer to the business and out of HR/global/core scope in order to improve effectiveness? I have an opinion, but I'd like to hear what you think first.
Absolutely. It's a great question. I do think HR plays a role to establish common standards of readiness, common competency frameworks across the organization. And without that, I think organizations can stray a bit from some of the objectivity that they need and consistency across the organization, particularly if they're looking to establish talent pipelines that reach into all corners of the organization, not just from a level, but also from a functional perspective. However, I think bringing them in, establishing buy-in and commitment and engagement from the business, that's absolutely critical to establishing the relevance of these programs. And relevance is really what's driven as a key outcome of personalization, and that relevance factor can play a massive role in determining whether someone actually absorbs and applies the activities that they go through in one of these structured programs. So connecting the high potential programs to the needs of the business, the context of the business, is one key route to establish that form of relevance.
I couldn't agree more. I think you've got to have someone who understands how leaders are developed and how people learn and how people grow, and to have an organizational and thematic unity to it. But I can't imagine a successful leadership development program, much less a high potential program, that's disconnected from the business leaders who need to provide the experiences and the exposure and the opportunity and the challenges that should be part of this kind of program. So, well, thank you. Thanks, Evan. Let me move on to just another couple of thoughts here. When we think about how people learn and how people grow, there's sometimes a disconnect between the ways in which people want to be developed as leaders, mind you, not perhaps, generally speaking, but as leaders, and the ways in which we often provide ways to learn. So on this slide, we're often looking at a higher level of formal workshops and training courses and seminars that are delivered, and yet what people particularly want, particularly among the high potential crew, is coaching from external mentors. They want that broader exposure, that broader perspective. You can see that books and articles are a top 4 choice, and look, I recognize also that people learn different ways. You've got to provide lots of different things. This was always part of what I put together, but you can see that it's not a desired choice. Certainly they want more coaching. They do want formal workshops. They do want coaching from their current manager, but less so much that it's by themselves. Because quite often you have these high potentials. This is something that they're already doing. This has been a hallmark of who they are as people and then as leaders as they start their journey. So what they're looking for from these programs is exposure to the things that take them out into the open forums and discussion areas and exposure opportunities. Notice also that coaching from external mentors is much lower in terms of being offered than the level at which it's desired. So I think there's something to be said for taking a look at how people learn, but also thinking about what's different about this high potential program. What's the access, the exposure, and the experiences that come from this, and how are you best positioned to provide those? When you're looking at making the most of high potential talent, we've talked a lot about this, but the top 5 here in terms of having a huge impact. Take a look at the first one, which is about developmental assignments. And it goes back to the conversation just a few moments ago, the question that Deborah raised. And that is about making sure that these developmental assignments, because nobody has the luxury of just doing a tour of duty in some place and you move in, you move out, you learn nothing, there's no accountability. You've got to do that with the business units, and that's paramount. You've got to make sure that unbiased and non-political elements characterize your identification of high potentials. As Evan mentioned, nothing removes credibility and trust like some opaque process. Look, everyone knows just about everything these days. And even if you haven't formally told them they're a high potential, most people kind of figure it out. They see who gets access and who gets exposure. They see how people are moved through different roles. And everybody figures it out. So you might as well have a candid conversation, and it prompts the conversation around, well, here are the kinds of things that we're looking for, and it's a consistent message, and then how do we help prepare you to be thought of as a high potential yourself, and what can we do to close some of those gaps? We haven't talked so much about this one, but it is about holding managers accountable for supporting high potential leaders. We can do all the right things, identify them in a fair and unbiased way, and have competency-based selection criteria. We can have cohort programs. We can link them up with the business and give them opportunities for developmental assignments, either short-term or long-term. But if you don't have managers who are held accountable for how he or she has brought that young leader along, that's a missed opportunity. And as we all know, what you don't measure doesn't get counted, and so therefore the accountability does not remain there. A couple of other ones are just about consistency, and we keep coming back to this need to measure. If you don't measure, it's very difficult to hold people accountable. Evan, anything to add to that one?
No, I think you described it well in terms of the expectations that are set whenever someone is designated a high potential employee. And for them, that already puts themselves in a higher standing, may cause them to have a higher degree of what they think should be coming to them and when. And those are opportunities and other instances where as soon as that identification occurs, and as you noted, whether or not the organization tries to keep it secret or not, that word gets around pretty quickly. So then the focus shifts to actually meeting these expectations and keeping individuals engaged and retained within the organization and taking the steps to do that. But unfortunately, many of the core practices that drive that type of engagement and retention aren't in place for many individuals.
Now, Evan, here's an interesting question from Larna. And she's asking whether or not high potential programs can be effective at identifying, developing more seasoned talent. And this is an interesting question. And given labor shortages, given skill sets, given a variety of factors, what's your thought here?
Right, it's a great topic and taps into something that we included in the research, looking at some of the challenges that leaders felt least prepared for, and one of those was retaining organizational knowledge. So as the mobility rates have increased across the organization, people have moved in and out of roles or out of the organization entirely. Organizational knowledge gaps have started to creep in, and of course that's an area where those that are more seasoned in the organization have such a powerful base of knowledge that make them as suited, if not more suited, for many high potential, high stakes roles. I think that also offers up the opportunity for some balanced coaching and some shared coaching across the generations and mentoring. So I think that's also an area where the seasoned talent can be engaged and recognized for their potential. I think it is a mistake that organizations can make to only and exclusively link high potential talent to a generational question, so only identifying the newest generation of having that type of potential. I don't think that's conducive to a broader pipeline view or really tapping into the full scope of diversity that exists in these organizations. And as Rebecca mentioned, on the context of high potential assignment is not a tattoo, but nor is exclusion from these pools a scarlet letter that skill profiles change as the needs for leaders change, as organizational knowledge becomes paramount and powerful within the organization. That can change the status of those that might be more seasoned in the organization but haven't yet had their chance to cycle through these high potential pools.
Evan, I think that makes a great deal of sense. And I'll probably steal that line without proper attribution going forward, but that's great, the scarlet letter. But it reminds me that elsewhere in the report, we talk about some of the skills that are necessary for effective leaders in this age of digital disruption. And amazingly, tech savvy was not that high on the list. It's important, but it's sort of table stakes. Some of the most important leadership elements continue to be the ability to articulate a vision, empathy, bringing people along and developing them. So I think there's something to what you've just said about those are many of the skills that quite often more seasoned leaders have. Question is, how do you prepare them for success in some of these other roles? So interesting thought. Mm-hmm. All right, Evan, I think the next section is something you were going to cover.
Absolutely. So playing out the research you just saw into some recommendations to organizations. So it does start with a clear criteria for competencies and expectations, and I would say a more often updated set of criteria. So increasing the cadence with which those competencies are reevaluated, because something that wasn't important 2 years ago, perhaps even didn't exist as a concept 2 years ago, is now more important and needs to be factored into the leadership success profile, and using that to drive objectivity around a common framework. And again, the role that HR can help play ensuring the consistency of these programs. Monitoring high potential reactions. Again, it sounds basic, it sounds obvious, but many organizations aren't doing this. So it's kind of a set it and forget it mindset in some cases. So after the shoulder tap occurs, are organizations really following through on the promise they've made to high potentials, that they're actually meeting their needs for personalization and relevance to their role. Evaluating these programs for bias and consistency. So we saw some surprising and frankly troubling instances of a lack of consistency and an existence of bias and subjectivity for many of these organizations. That needs to be constantly revisited. So in terms of what high potential leaders are seeking, so they're seeking tailored learning experiences. All leaders are seeking personalization, but high potentials have a higher threshold of expectation for those experiences. We also know that they recognize and respond well and respect the opportunities to engage in external coaching. So in some cases, leaders feel like they won't and can't get the coaching they need from their manager alone, and giving leaders access to external mentors that can provide a broader perspective outside of the company walls on some of the challenges that they're facing. Both short-term and longer-term projects, as well as rotational assignments, are also part of that mix for high potentials and part of their expectation for being in those roles. Of course, not all of this can occur through a formal assignment to ship someone off to a foreign land, and this is where simulations can fill in some of the gap here to provide challenging experiences that have a developmental base to them, that often are used to provide intensive feedback and coaching to leaders. This can also be an opportunity to provide a common set of experiences across those that might be considered for high potential roles or high stakes roles in the organization, using simulation tools as a way to gather that information before it's needed, so that organizations can be more planful in making these assignments when they come available.
Thanks, Evan. I've got a quick question here. Actually, there's two of them. The first one is, what are some examples of bias that you've seen that others may miss? Now, you've mentioned, eliminating generations because you think that they're just not included in the selection process. Is there something else that you might highlight?
Well, I think I mentioned briefly the what I would call a functional form of bias, where there's an assumption that someone has to have moved through the sales organization, is a great example, or the operations part of the business. And I think it's important to take into account, what is it truly that individuals are getting through those experiences, and are there other ways to assess that in a more consistent way? I think many senior leaders can fall prey to this perception of a magical resume that exists out there that surprisingly looks quite similar to their own in some cases. And I think that's where bias can creep in when senior leaders are seeking to recognize that they had a particular experience and they're seeing that as the route to the top, but not perhaps recognizing that there may be other routes to the top that they aren't accounting for. So I think that's the most likely and most common form of bias I've seen when organizations are putting in place high potential pools. And of course, that's counteracted by a more objective view of the true keys to success. What is it that these experiences give you, and not using experiences themselves as a proxy for something that leaders who come from a certain background that might be identical to the current CEO, they may not actually have. So putting in place some checks and balances there to make sure that's not occurring.
And thank you, Janelle, for the question. Joe Castle asked a question around the organization does a great job of hiring and developing high potential employees, but opportunities for advancement are extremely limited. What suggestions do you have to keep high potentials engaged in a talent bottleneck situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question, and I welcome your thoughts on this too, Rebecca. I think this is something that organizations who have become leaner are challenged with, and I think it starts with reorienting development beyond promotion, and recognizing that there are other forms of development that in some cases are as rewarding for individuals as a promotion. Of course, in some cases, promotion is warranted, but in other cases, it's just simply not possible as organizations narrow. I do think this is an issue that many organizations who expanded their high potential pools without fully accounting for what they do with those in those pools, how do they actually meet those expectations? That's something we've seen that has been linked to higher attrition rates for high potentials when they don't have this plan in place. And so I think it's about having individual conversations in some cases to understand the motivating factors for having the opportunity to participate in a very intensive simulation of your future skills, or certainly developmental assignments or something more targeted that allows for alternative channels for growth and development beyond promotion. Because if development is exclusively associated with promotion, organizations find themselves in that pinch point that's being described.
I know
there.
In the separate work that you and I and our teams have done on millennial leadership, a lot of it truly is not about getting a promotion, but it is about gaining the exposure and the experiences and the skill development that makes them eminently more comfortable in a world that is unknown, that they will inherit as leaders. So I think there's something to be said for that. And I think your point about continual communication is critical here, so that people understand we have great expectations for you, we have great faith in your abilities, we're going to give you some opportunities to build those strengths and continue to grow as a leader, and it's going to look like this. And having a consistent process of developing people through rotational programs or whatever the case may be is critical. I do have one other question, and I'm going to save it though and ask you to go ahead and continue on our journey here, if you wouldn't mind, Evan.
Sure, and this is summarizing some of our observations here. So these programs aren't having the impact they need to, so it requires some rethinking and reorientation to enhancing that approach. And part of that is expanding the approach. So that's not just deepening the view of potentials across the organization, but also reconsidering how an organization defines high potential and making sure this isn't drawing on some archaic or outdated assumptions of the routes to the top or those that have the perspectives needed to advance the organization. And we are finding that there's a financial payoff for this deeper and broader view of potential. So when organizations only limit their view to just the senior level roles, they're much more limited and unlikely to see financial success. And in fact, they're 4.2 times more likely to be financially successful compared to their peers when they have a full pipeline approach to developing high potential talent.
You know, I think that's right, Evan. It really is a matter of focus, and it really is also about hedging your bets. You know, we don't know exactly what the world will be. And I think hopefully most organizations have moved away from names in a box and that kind of very rigid succession planning. It is about developing pools of people, because you don't know how many you're going to eventually be able to retain. You also don't know exactly what you're going to need by the time these folks will need to step into some of these roles. And having folks from a broader, more diverse pool who've come along and had some shared experiences and some unique experiences puts you in a much better position to be able to fulfill the leadership needs that your organization will have, even in a world you can't truly imagine just yet. I mean, think about how much the world has changed in the last decade or so. So here's a wonderful quote. Bet on everyone. There are tremendous benefits to saying let's invest in everyone, but we will differentiate the amount of resources we invest in people. And having an awful lot more people feel as though they have an opportunity to learn and grow helps you retain talent of all types. So, couple things I might mention, and I just want to make sure that in these closing moments, and I want to open it up to some questions. We have a couple more, Evan. But I want to let people know that you can download the entire report. You'll see the hyperlink there. What we haven't referenced is that there's an entire series of country or region-specific reports that have been done, as well as in several industry verticals. And I would encourage you to take a look at the full panoply of global leadership forecast-related reports. It's a rich compository of content. So please do take a look at that. So let's just take two questions here. Here's one from Deborah. She wants to know the opinion on providing simulations of major events or decisions to practice reacting to realistic scenarios versus taking people completely out of their comfort zone and putting them in a zombie apocalypse scenario.
And that's great. I saw that question come through, so I was hoping
Right.
we would get to that. And I am intrigued by the idea of a management simulation oriented around a zombie apocalypse. But I do think that might face some challenging perspectives in terms of the relevance concepts that we talked about earlier. So I think that is the key, and we've seen that in our study of leaders and how they respond to programs. What really makes these programs stick. They stick because they see application opportunities. They stick because they see a sense of urgency for the situations that they're challenged by. They stick because they see the relevance in what they're challenged by. And I think Rebecca, in comments about a minute ago, in terms of how do you gauge and how do you prepare for a broader form of readiness rather than moving from fighting one fire to another and only establishing a very limited view of readiness for what's next. Because, of course, we can't predict what's next in their entirety. We've also seen some organizations delve more deeply into wargaming scenarios that put individuals into realistic but also very challenging situations and providing behavioral and feedback on the observable behaviors that they exhibit during those simulations.
I think that's right, Evan. I'm also a big fan of experiential leadership programs where people are sort of immersed in a setting where they looked at the decisions that other leaders made and tried to glean the lessons from those and to apply them to their own scenarios, whether that's at Gettysburg or the Apollo program or Miracle on the Hudson or a variety of things. I mean, those are wonderful programs that we also do here at the Conference Board, and I've personally found them to be of great value. And sometimes putting cohorts of high potentials through that sort of a common language is a great thing. We have time, I think, for one more question, Evan, and it's around the metrics that successful organizations are using to measure success.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of success of these programs, we think it does start with reactions and feedback from those who have recently gone through the program. That's where you can get an early sense of the perception of relevance or expectations for how follow-up to these programs will be supported. We've seen all too often examples where someone, high potential or otherwise, will go through a program, but their manager may not even know they went through the program, or at worst, not be prepared to support them as an outcome of these programs. And I think that's where it starts. I think from there you start to cascade it out to individual level skill growth on the competencies targeted by the assessment, and this starts with confidence for individuals, but also radiates quickly out to what others are seeing. So we're a strong advocate of observer-based feedback on key competencies and key skill targets. And then, of course, it starts to cascade out further to the group. And this is where you might start to bring in team-level metrics for engagement or productivity. And then ultimately, it does lead up to business-level impact, but it takes a few steps before it gets there. And organizations that look to just make that connection immediately between point A and point Z without understanding any of the intervening factors makes it much harder to course correct when these programs aren't seeing the impact that they'd like to. So we do think that it's a multi-step approach to measurement to truly understand the roots of success and also influence when needed to improve these programs.
Yeah, nothing beats the ability to do a snapshot in time before the program and after the program, and how much difference did it make. I think just to be able to say that folks who came through this particular cohort successfully had X amount of greater success in tangible metrics against their counterparts. But even if you look at the ability to immediately fill, one of the early slides we had today, the ability to immediately fill with an internal person successfully, which is down to 43%. If you can't show that you're able to do that, and you can't show that you have progress over time, I think that's a real challenge too. Well, in our last closing moments, I want to remind you that this is part of an ongoing series, this Global Leadership Forecast. The next one is in January, and as you see here, this is going to be about digital era leadership, which we've touched on a couple of times today. And our colleagues, Joe Detman and Amanda Papila, will be taking you through that particular aspect of the report. And I would mention also that we've got a couple of related conferences that are coming up, and we're offering you as a special opportunity here a huge discount on some of our upcoming conferences, many of which we do in partnership with our colleagues from DDI and from EY. There are others here that you might choose to choose from. That sounds redundant, and actually it is redundant. But whether that's in talent management or executive coaching or leadership development conferences, the Women's Leadership Conference, or the Diversity and Inclusion Conference, I hope you'll take advantage of this special offer. So I think the last thing I would say is that we do take feedback very seriously. We'd like to make these as on point and as beneficial to people who choose to take time out of their day to join us. I personally take a look at all of the things that come in. We do try to take them to heart and do better. So if there are opportunities for improvement, I hope you'll let us know what they might be. And if you also have ideas about the kinds of research or topics that you'd like to see, let us know that as well. And be sure to sign up for the entire series. Evan and I will do another appearance together. We also have other friends that we play with, and so you'll see some of those combinations. But I particularly enjoy working with Evan, and I learn a great deal. So Evan, in closing, let me just simply say how much I appreciated your finding some time today to join me, and I want to thank all of our folks who chose to join for joining us as well. So thank you, Evan.
Thank you. A mutual pleasure, and
Great.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye now.